today we're going to cover at 5 o'clock the impeachment from Saturday. I watched the whole thing on Saturday, and I thought it was outstanding.
Yeah, it's interesting because it didn't get a lot of play. We do have some audio from it, if you'd like.
Yeah.
Do we have this clip? Mike pulled this morning, Sarah, about withholding aid. How common is that? Because we're told that is like, you can't withhold aid from a foreign country.
He was quid pro quo. He was withholding aid. That's the worst thing you could possibly do.
All right.
Listen.
So the made-up narrative that security assistance was conditioned on Ukraine taking some action on investigations is further disproved by the straightforward fact that the aid was delivered on September 11th, 2019, without Ukraine taking any action on any investigation.
Well, there's that.
It's interesting to note that the Obama administration withheld $585 million of promised aid to Egypt in 2013. But the administration's public message was that the money was not officially on hold, as technically it was not due until September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. So they didn't have to disclose the halt to anyone. Sounds like this may be a practice of a number of administrations. In fact, to the president, this president has been concerned about how aid is being put forward. So there have been pauses on foreign aid in a variety of contexts. In September of 2019, the administration announced that it was withholding over $100 million in aid to Afghanistan over concerns about government corruption. In August of 2019, President Trump announced that the administration and Seoul were in talks to substantially increase South Korea's share of the expense of U.S. military support for South Korea. In June, President Trump cut or paused over $550 million in foreign aid to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala because those countries were not fairly sharing the burdens of preventing mass migration to the United States. This is not the only administration. As I said, President Obama withheld hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to Egypt. To be clear, and I want to be clear, Ambassador Yovanovitch herself testified that our policy actually got stronger under President Trump. Largely because, unlike the Obama administration, quote, this administration made the decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine to help Ukraine fend off Russian aggression. She testified in a deposition before your various committees that, and actually I felt that in the 3 years that I was there, partly because of my efforts, but also the interagency team and President Trump's decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, that our policy actually got stronger. Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent, his name's come up a couple of times, agreed that javelins are incredibly effective weapons at stopping armored advance, and the Russians are scared of them. Ambassador Volker explained that President Trump approved each of the decisions made along the way, and as a result, America's policy towards Ukraine strengthened. So when we want to talk about facts, go to your own discovery and your own witnesses that you called. This all supposedly started because of a whistleblower. Where is that whistleblower?
I thought that was incredibly effective, and the entire process, it lasted, I think, 3 hours on Saturday from start to finish. And I thought the entire process was that good all the way along. These are the facts that you haven't heard before. I mean, there was nothing new to learn. I tried to watch it last week, but there was nothing new all last week, and they just kept repeating it over and over and over again. And it was like, what are you doing? These guys stood up and said, we're not going to take 24 hours. We don't need 24 hours. We're going to give you 3 hours today. We're going to come back on Monday, and then we'll come back on Tuesday, and we'll be done. Because there's not 24 hours worth of stuff to go over. They don't have a case.
I agree. I think, too, there's a problem here in that the argument was set up, I think, in such a faulty way at the beginning with this idea that there's no quid pro quo And, that's basically the entire argument. I think if you just look at this case in the way it's supposed to be, which they outline here, that we do have quid pro quos when we're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars to other countries. Yeah, they got to do stuff for us. Those things need to be done. They need to be maybe not wasting all the money. They don't need, it doesn't go to terrorists. It doesn't, there's a million different restrictions that are put on foreign policy all the time. And for whatever reason, both the White House and many on the Republican side fell into this trap of setting an incredibly low hurdle for Democrats to clear, just that there was a quid pro quo. Well, there should be a quid pro quo. That's what when you're throwing
all of capitalism is a quid pro quo.
Exactly.
It's just not, I think, the way the White House is interpreted, because this is the way it was interpreted by the defense, by the prosecution, and you don't let them define terms. But I think they let the prosecution define quid pro quo as bribery or something nefarious, where instead, no, I'm not giving Afghanistan the money because they've got a problem with corruption. Clean it up. No, I'm not giving that country because they're not helping out on what they're supposed to be doing for NATO. Clear it up. That's normal procedure. But remember, they were equating it with bribery. And I think that's the only explanation I can come up with why the defense was saying no quid pro quo. They were using it in a way of bribery.
Yeah, and I think this happens from time to time. You don't want to give any ground to the left because they will take it and they will burn you on it, and it never helps. And that's an understandable instinct. But I think more importantly is defending the right ground and making sure that, this is where I stand. Be proud of the fact that you had a quid pro quo and held back money because you thought they were corrupt. That's a totally legitimate point and a totally legitimate position for a White House to take. And the fact that it's been done before really supports that, because we, of course, are going to do those things. Instead, we wind up going, we didn't know anything about this ambassador. Well, again, these are such low bars to clear. Now you have, people talking on tape. I don't know who Lev Parnas is or whatever. Well, you had dinner with him all these times, or at least this one lengthy time, and it's on tape. And it's like, well, instead of these giving absolutely no ground, and just trying to defend every single position that it's a perfect call, for example, if you're instead step back and say, look, what we're doing, here's the overall thing we're doing, and this is the right thing to be doing because this is in the national interest of this country. If that were the argument from the beginning, none of these points could even be made, because every piece of evidence backs up that we were acting in that fashion, with the exception of if you just don't believe Donald Trump ever acts in the American interest. And if you're that person, well, you're in that 40% of Democrats who believe that, and you're never going to win any of those people over. But to anyone in the middle, and I don't think this is working on the Democrat side, but anyone who's in the middle or an undecided voter or an independent voter, I think looks at this and says, wait a minute, that makes sense. If we're going to dump $400 million to Ukraine, shouldn't we make sure they're not just wasting it or giving it to corrupt officials, or it's going into Joe Biden's son's pocket?
This is the feeling that I got on Saturday, that if I were sitting there in the Senate, I would have said, well, all that makes sense. And how come the Democrats never told me any of this?
Yeah.
Their case was taken apart because the Trump team didn't introduce anything new. They just took pieces of the testimony that was never reported, never brought up, not in the press and not in the impeachment setup from the prosecution. So if you're sitting there, you feel as though the Democrats lied to you, and they did. They left a lot of exonerating evidence out completely and didn't explain it away. If you have exonerating evidence, you have to, when you first step up and make your case and say, they're going to say this. Well, that's not what the Republicans said. They didn't stand up and say what Schiff said. They just went back to the evidence and said, I want you to see here, here, and here. How come they left this out? Why didn't they tell you about this? Because this really changes everything, doesn't it? And I think it's critical that Americans, especially if you are looking for the truth and the part of the impeachment that you have not heard before, you need to listen to this today.